The man known to history as George Washington was born on the 22nd of February 1732 at his father's plantation of Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County in the colony of Virginia, one of the 13 British colonies in North America. His father was Augustine Washington, a member of Virginia's landed gentry and a successful businessman who owned several tobacco plantations as well as iron operations in Virginia and neighboring Maryland, in partnership with the English Principio Company. He was also active in the local militia and was a justice of the peace and sheriff for Westmoreland County. Augustine had married his first wife, Jane Butler, in 1715, who bore him 4 children before her death in 1729. A couple of years later, in 1731, he would marry the 23-year-old Mary Johnson Ball, who would give him a further 6 children, of whom George was the eldest. Mary Washington was born in 1708 to an elderly father who died 3 years later, leaving her 400 acres of land, while her mother died when she was 12. The orphaned Mary was left in the care of family friend George Eskridge, who was probably responsible for introducing her to Augustine Washington. Thus, when Mary gave birth to her first son, she named him George. Brought up as a loyal subject of the British Empire, as a child, George Washington could never imagine that one day he would be responsible for leading the successful military rebellion to break free from Britain and establish the United States of America. He grew up in eastern Virginia amidst a vast expanse of farmland with plantation houses and small towns dotted across the landscape. Within the British social hierarchy, the Washingtons were considered commoners, far removed from the regal splendor of the court of King George II. Nevertheless, within the American colonies, the Washingtons were by no means poor, and with over 10,000 acres of plantation land, together with his other commercial interests, Augustine Washington was certainly a member of the local elite. His wealth and prosperity depended in part on slave labor, allowing plantation owners a lot of free time, which was typically filled with fox hunts, horse races, and other entertainments. Augustine Washington's tendency to move around his properties to better manage his business interests meant that George had an unsettled childhood. In 1735, the family moved to the 2,500-acre estate of Little Hunting Creek on the banks of the Potomac River, and 3 years later, in 1738, they moved once again to Ferry Farm on the Rappahannock River across from the port of Fredericksburg and a short ride away from the ironworks at Accokeek Creek. From his house, George could see the ships being loaded with tobacco, iron, and other commodities, which would soon fuel the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution, and in return, the colony of Virginia grew steadily richer. One of the most important figures in George's childhood was his half-brother Lawrence. 14 years older than George, Lawrence studied at Appleby Grammar School, where he stayed on as a teacher until the age of 20. It was around this time, when George was 6 years old, that the two brothers first met. He heard stories of Lawrence's service as a captain in a Virginia company in 1739 during the War of Jenkins' Ear against Spain, named after the British naval captain whose ear had been cut off during an altercation with the Spanish several years earlier. Lawrence was part of an expeditionary force led by Admiral Edward Vernon, which attacked the Spanish port of Cartagena in South America. The effort proved a bloody failure as the force was cut down by the enemy and yellow fever. Captain Washington never made it off the ship, blaming General Thomas Wentworth, who treated the American soldiers with disdain and did not even let them leave their ships. In spite of this, Lawrence Washington proudly served the British Army as a commissioned officer and was appointed Adjutant General of Virginia, with responsibility over the organization of the colony's militia companies. When his father transferred him to the management of the estate at Little Hunting Creek, he renamed it Mount Vernon after the admiral. George may have expected to receive the same classical education as his elder half-brothers, but such hopes were extinguished on the 12th of April 1743 when his father died at the age of 49. The 11-year-old George's share of his father's inheritance was Ferry Farm, but his mother Mary continued to run the estate and would continue to do so as George reached adulthood. Mary's strict upbringing of her 5 surviving children meant that the relationship between mother and son was cool and distant, with George addressing her in formal terms in his letters as "Honoured Madam." He looked forward to his trips to visit Lawrence at Mount Vernon as an escape from his overbearing mother. Details of George Washington's early education are sketchy, and any instruction he received was likely rather basic. The available evidence suggests that he had lessons in basic mathematics and picked up knowledge of business and economics of his own accord. As a teenager, he would read widely in history and philosophy, as well as the popular fiction of the time. He also enjoyed physical activity and outdoor pursuits, swimming in the Rappahannock, and proved to be an excellent horseback rider, an attribute that would serve him well in his military career. Later in life, Washington regretted not having the opportunity to study French, Latin, and Greek, the signs of social and intellectual distinction of the day. Among his better educated friends and colleagues such as John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton, who provided the theoretical and intellectual foundations of the United States of America, Washington's intellect seemed backward and provincial. In his own terms, however, he was an intelligent man who could translate ideas into action. After losing his father, Washington came to rely even more heavily on his brother Lawrence, who had not only been elected to the House of Burgesses, but had married Anne Fairfax, whose family owned more than 5 million acres, managed by her father, Colonel William Fairfax, on behalf of his English cousin, the 6th Baron Fairfax. The young George Washington befriended Anne's brother, George William Fairfax, who was 8 years his senior, and also won the affection of her father, the Colonel. In 1746, the elder Fairfax and Lawrence planned to help George escape the clutches of his mother by joining the Royal Navy. Unwilling to lose a useful helping hand on the farm, Mary eventually vetoed the plan. Thwarted in his ambitions to go to sea, at the age of 15, George decided to become a surveyor, a lucrative profession as settlers continued to expand westwards. This training allowed him to appreciate geographical features on maps and in the real world, a skill which he would use throughout his professional life. His first job in the spring of 1748 was to help the Fairfaxes divide up their vast domains into plots for further development. Within a couple of years, he would make his first investments in land, buying up over 2,000 acres by the time he turned 20. George would add to his land holdings in 1752 following the death of Lawrence from tuberculosis that July at the age of 34, leaving behind his wife and a baby daughter. Lawrence stipulated that in the event of their deaths, his estate of Mount Vernon would pass on to George. The death of his brother dealt a heavy blow to George, who had hoped to emulate Lawrence's military career. After lobbying the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, he was appointed Adjutant General of his home district in February 1753 with the rank of Major. Major Washington would soon be a very busy man. By 1753, both the British and French empires owned large tracts of land in North America. The 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern coast, bounded by the Allegheny Mountains to the west, while the French territories ran from New Orleans in the southwest through the Mississippi to the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River in the north. As both empires expanded their footprint, they soon had competing claims on the vast Ohio country. In 1752, the French began building several forts in the disputed territory, and the following year, Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie, a leading investor in the Ohio Company, received permission from London to build a set of British forts alongside instructions to inform the French to leave the area. The 21-year-old Washington was chosen for this special mission and set off with a small company and crossed the Alleghenies in November 1753. Washington executed his task diligently, not only carrying out his diplomatic duties, but gathering intelligence on the terrain and the strength of the French and Native American presence in the area. Upon his return to the colonial capital of Williamsburg in January 1754, his journal was adapted into a report for the council and was passed on to London, where it informed British military preparations to defend the Ohio country against the French. Washington secured for himself a major role in these military preparations, leading a small militia force who would march to the forks of the Ohio River and construct a fort. At the same time, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, though he was disappointed that as a colonial officer, his salary was much lower than those of regular officers in the British Army who had royal commissions. In early April, Washington set out with 160 men into the wilderness, only to learn that a force of 1,000 Frenchmen had captured the fort the British were building at the Forks and renamed it Fort Duquesne after the Governor-General of French Canada. Washington and his Native American allies called for reinforcements and made camp. On the 28th of May, 1754, Washington and his company found a small group of French soldiers encamped in a secluded position. Believing them to be up to no good, Washington's men surrounded them, and a quick firefight resulted in a French surrender. During the skirmish, a French officer delivering a diplomatic message asking the British to evacuate the Ohio County was supposedly brutally killed by one of Washington's Native American allies. The act sparked an international incident, and while Washington was applauded in the colonies for being a hero, the authorities in London considered his behavior reckless and further evidence that colonial soldiers could not be trusted. Anticipating a French response, Washington hastily constructed a wooden fort named Fort Necessity. During these preparations, his commanding officer had died after falling off his horse, and Washington took command of the Virginia Regiment as colonel. When he disregarded his Native American allies' advice to withdraw on account of the inadequate defenses provided by the fort, they deserted him and left the British to fight alone. When the French and their Native American allies attacked on the 3rd of July, Washington put up a brave fight, but lost a third of his men and was forced to surrender. It was a humiliating defeat, and he had made many mistakes owing to his lack of experience, but he learned from it the effectiveness of the enemy's mobile tactics and the futility of defending poor positions. The defeat could have ended Washington's military career before it started, but instead, after a few weeks had passed, he and his men were praised for their brave last stand against the odds. While the Virginia Regiment was disbanded, leaving Washington without a command, his personal fortunes improved when his late brother Lawrence's daughter died at the end of December. As Anne had already remarried, Washington agreed to lease the estate of Mount Vernon from his sister-in-law and made it his main residence. Not long after he moved into Mount Vernon, Washington received news in February 1755 that General Edward Braddock had landed with 2 regiments of reinforcements from Britain. Washington rushed to offer his services, and Braddock was happy to have him as aide-de-camp. Leaving his younger brother Jack in charge of Mount Vernon, Washington joined Braddock in June, and the army made its slow progress towards Fort Duquesne. Although personally warm towards Washington, Braddock held the same disdain for colonial soldiers as many of his fellow officers in the regular army, and refused to heed his aide-de-camp's advice to travel lightly, before eventually giving in to the situation to pick up the glacial pace of the advance. On the 9th of July, Braddock approached Fort Duquesne with more than 2,000 men and divided his army into 3 columns to attack. The British were surprised by the ferocious defense of 900 French and Native Americans, whose tactics once again proved superior. Washington bravely carried out Braddock's orders to rally the troops, exposing himself to great danger with 2 horses shot from underneath him. This was not enough to bring victory, and Braddock himself was mortally wounded. Following Braddock's death, the Virginia Regiment was reformed, and Washington was appointed commander of all of Virginia's forces. Despite these rapid promotions, Washington remained unhappy about not receiving a royal commission. He resented London's strategy to pursue active operations in Canada while remaining on the defensive on the frontiers of Virginia, leaving him nothing to do but to train and drill his men. He was dismayed by the state of the militiamen under his responsibility, many of whom deserted en masse. In late 1757, he was struck down by a grave illness that prompted him to return to Mount Vernon. During this time, he would begin to make changes to the estate and create a house fit for an English country gentleman. In early 1758, after a brief courtship, he was engaged to Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy 26-year-old widow whose husband had died the previous summer, leaving her with 2 young children. A warm and sociable woman, Martha was the polar opposite of her mother-in-law Mary, and proved a steadfast support in her husband's life and career, capable not only of carrying out the domestic duties of a housewife, but also of running the Mount Vernon estate in her husband's absence. In July 1758, Washington returned to action as the British made a further attempt to seize Fort Duquesne and avenge the loss of Braddock, this time serving under the Scottish General John Forbes. In the meantime, he entered political office for the first time by handsomely winning election to the Virginia House of Burgesses representing Frederick County, a reflection of his reputation as a war hero. Despite some disagreements with his superior and a devastating friendly fire incident which claimed the lives of more than 20 of his men, Washington led 2,500 men and successfully recaptured Fort Duquesne in November 1758. Instead of the ferocious defense he had met on previous occasions, he encountered no resistance at all, as the French chose to abandon and destroy the fort after falling out with their Native American allies. The British rebuilt it and named it Fort Pitt, after War Minister William Pitt, while the city that was built around it would take the name of Pittsburgh, in the state of Pennsylvania. The action would be Washington's last in the French and Indian War, better known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, where the fighting between Britain and France, supported by their respective allies, would last until 1763. Washington returned to Mount Vernon and married Martha on the 6th of January 1759, making him one of Virginia's richest landowners. In their efforts to emulate the upper class in England, importing the latest fashions from London, Washington became increasingly indebted to his London agents and resented their power over the colonial planters. At the same time, he carried out his civic duties in the House of Burgesses, serving on committees related to military matters and limiting any speeches to the most important points of the debate. For the next 2 decades of his life, Washington would devote his energies to his plantation, in particular to growing tobacco. This proved a poor economic decision, and one Washington would later regret, as the quality of the tobacco crop was highly dependent on weather conditions, while international market prices were volatile. These factors contributed to Washington's struggles repaying his debts to his creditors in London. Another key aspect of tobacco farming was its labor intensiveness and dependence on slavery. During his life, Washington owned over 600 slaves. He and his fellow planters treated slaves as any other type of property to be bought and sold, although over time he grew to despise the practice and treated his slaves more humanely than most of his peers, looking after their health and eventually refusing to sell any of his slaves in order to keep families together. The French and Indian War ended in 1763 in a decisive victory for the British in North America. France had lost Canada to Britain and Louisiana to Spain. The cost to the British Treasury had been enormous, and half the national budget went on interest repayments on government debt. In an effort to fill the hole in government coffers, Parliament attempted to impose taxes and other economic costs onto the North American colonies, preventing the existing colonies from further westward expansion. As a soldier, Washington had resented the superior attitude of the British authorities and their refusal to give him a royal commission. As a businessman, Washington now had cause to consider the decisions of the British authorities to be detrimental to his economic interests. The most infamous piece of legislation passed by Parliament was the Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed a tax on all printed material, including legal documents, newspapers, and playing cards. Washington may not have been the most radical of the voices protesting against the Stamp Act on the political stage, but he considered the tax unconstitutional and wrote to his representatives in London that the colonies would begin to boycott British goods in favour of domestic substitutes, and courts would shut down, preventing British creditors from collecting their dues from their American debtors. At around the same time, and perhaps concerned about his dependency on British credit, Washington decided to diversify away from tobacco, eventually abandoning the crop altogether in favour of wheat, corn, hemp, and dozens of other crops. Mount Vernon also had an extensive fishing enterprise from the plentiful stocks on the Potomac, initially for consumption within the house and later salted and cured for export to international markets. The diversification away from the labor-intensive tobacco crop encouraged Washington to train his surplus slaves in a number of crafts, such as carpentry, bricklaying, smithing, and baking. Although Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, it continued to assert the right to taxation in the colonies, prompting sustained opposition which spread throughout the 13 colonies. In 1767, the Townshend Acts, named after the British Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, levied duties on paint, lead, glass, paper, and tea. During the winter of 1768–69, Washington's attitude became more radical, and he supported a boycott of British goods. While he did not rule out armed insurrection against what he considered a sustained attack on American liberties, he believed that non-violent economic measures should be used first. In April 1769, Washington took a more proactive role in the House of Burgesses, intending to present a plan for the importation of British goods developed alongside his friend George Mason of Fairfax County. The following month, the Assembly voted in favour of a set of resolves which asserted that the House of Burgesses had the sole right to tax Virginians. In response, the royal governor, Lord Beaucourt, dissolved the body, forcing the Burgesses to reconvene in a tavern, where they debated and adopted Washington's proposals to boycott the goods subject to taxation under the Townshend Acts. The move had some effect, prompting the new British government under Lord North to repeal the Townshend Acts, keeping only the levies on tea to continue asserting Parliament's right to taxation. The situation had temporarily been diffused, but the remaining taxes on tea provoked the Boston Tea Party on the 16th of December 1773, when a group of men from the American patriot organization Sons of Liberty boarded a merchant ship belonging to the East India Company and dumped its valuable cargo of tea into Boston Harbor. While Washington was dismayed by the protest, he was furious at the British response, which involved passing a number of draconian measures against Boston, collectively known as the Intolerable Acts, the most important of which closed the port of Boston to trade until the East India Company was compensated for the loss of cargo. In the House of Burgesses, Washington supported an initiative to show solidarity with Boston by convening a Congress of all 13 colonies to protect their collective rights. In July 1774, while chairing a meeting in Fairfax County, which he had represented since 1765, Washington passed the Fairfax Resolves, which he had drafted alongside George Mason, asserting that taxation and representation are in their nature inseparable. Washington thus became one of the leading advocates of resistance against Britain, and on the 5th of August he was elected to Virginia's 7-man delegation to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, which would meet the following month. Surrounded by some of the finest orators of the day, Washington spoke rarely but effectively, bringing together different viewpoints. As the delegates were increasingly convinced that war would break out, Washington's name was on many of their lips when it came to a commander-in-chief. The 42-year-old Washington had developed a sense of political maturity that had been absent in his younger days, and did not actively lobby for the command, confident that his reputation would be enough to secure the post. For the time being, the Continental Congress was content to set up a continental association to coordinate efforts among the colonies to ban trade with Great Britain. On the 19th of April 1775, British redcoats and American militiamen exchanged fire at Concord and Lexington in Massachusetts, marking the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. Washington had already secured election to the Second Continental Congress, which opened on the 10th of May, with the agenda firmly focused on raising militia and volunteers across the colonies. Washington appeared in the Congress wearing his colonel's uniform, and his expertise in military affairs was in high demand among his fellow delegates. On the 14th of June, the Congress assumed control of the volunteer army, laying siege to the British forces in Boston under the command of General Thomas Gage, thereby creating the Continental Army, and Washington was appointed General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies on the 16th. While on his way to take command of the Continentals in Boston, Washington received news of the Battle of Bunker Hill on the 17th of June, where 2,000 men under General William Howe successfully captured the American positions, but at the cost of 1,000 casualties, demonstrating that the Continentals were more than capable of putting up a fight. Upon arriving in Boston, Washington sought to instill in his men the idea that they were a national army rather than from a collection of states. Upon inspecting his army, he was disappointed to find that he only had 14,000 men fit for duty living in poor conditions, while supplies of gunpowder were dangerously low. Fearing British spies, he kept quiet about these deficiencies to all but his closest confidants. During this period, the Commander-in-Chief came to be particularly close to Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island, as well as 25-year-old artillery commander Colonel Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller who had learned everything about military affairs from the books and the British officers he talked to in his shop. Washington struggled in his efforts to create a professional standing army. Recruits were authorized to serve for 1 year, with the effect that no sooner had they been trained and drilled to fight effectively, they would melt away and return to their homes. As he faced losing his entire army on the 1st of January 1776, Washington attempted to persuade the men to re-enlist, but fewer than 10,000 would agree to do so by the end of the year. In order to bolster numbers, Washington considered recruiting from the black population. While black soldiers had fought in the ranks of the volunteers in Massachusetts and were considered every bit as brave as their white counterparts, as a leading figure of Virginia's slaveholding class, the thought of arming black men raised the prospect of slave rebellion. At a war council in October, Washington prohibited any black soldiers from serving in the Continental Army. But upon hearing that Virginia's governor, Lord Dunmore, had promised to free slaves who were to join the British Army, Washington compromised and allowed free blacks to serve in his ranks, who would make up around 10% of the Continental Army. As winter approached, Washington realized he could not abandon his army and return to Mount Vernon, and instead invited his wife Martha to stay with him. Martha Washington would spend half the war with her husband on campaign, serving as a trusted confidant for his concerns and anxieties about his army and the war. The condition Washington's men found themselves in during the first winter of the war caused morale to plummet, leading the men to question if their cause could ever succeed. The politicians in Philadelphia were still split on whether to declare independence, and some still believed in petitioning King George III and reconciling with Britain. The publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense in January 1776 highlighted the tyrannical power of monarchy and galvanized the movement for independence. Spirits further increased on the 17th of January when Henry Knox arrived after accomplishing the incredible logistical feat of hauling almost 60 pieces of cannon from Fort Ticonderoga in New York near the Canadian border across the December snows to Washington's camp. Although Washington still lacked the powder for a full assault on Boston, he successfully maneuvered the cannon onto the Dorchester Heights overlooking the city during the course of a single night on the 4th of March, leaving the British with no choice but to evacuate. Having captured Boston without losing a single man, Washington hurried to New York, believing that General Howe would attempt to take the city. Although the city's geography made it difficult to defend from the British Army, and there was a large population of loyalists sympathizing with the British, Washington recognized the political and commercial importance to the Continental cause and felt compelled to make a stand despite being significantly outnumbered. Meanwhile, the drumbeat for independence was sounding ever louder, and the Declaration of Independence drafted by Thomas Jefferson, Washington's colleague in the Virginia House of Burgesses, was adopted by Congress on the 4th of July 1776 and was received with wild enthusiasm by the Continental Army when Washington read the declaration to them on the 8th. The enthusiasm was premature, as the British Army and Navy, commanded by brothers William and Richard Howe, soon descended on New York at the head of 32,000 men and 70 warships, keen to defeat the rebellion once and for all. By mid-August, Washington had 23,000 men under his command, but most were inexperienced recruits. Meanwhile, when the British landed 2/3 of their force at Long Island, Washington misread it as a diversion and only sent 6,000 men to defend the Brooklyn Heights to the west of the island, keeping most of his men in Manhattan. On the 26th, the Continentals were surrounded by the British, with 300 killed and 1,000 captured. But on the night of the 29th of August, Washington took advantage of Howe's reluctance to stage a full pursuit by evacuating all the men from Long Island to Manhattan. The commander himself was on the last boat across the East River, shrouded from the British by thick fog. A few days later, Washington withdrew from the city to the north. The Continentals had built Fort Washington and Fort Lee overlooking the Hudson River, but these were taken by the British in November, forcing the Continentals to flee across to New Jersey. These setbacks also called into question Washington's command abilities, and his subordinate, General Charles Lee, schemed to replace him. Upon discovering the plot, Washington said nothing to Lee, who received his comeuppance in mid-December when he was captured by the British. Washington's Continental Army was a bedraggled group of fewer than 4,000 men when it crossed the Delaware River to Pennsylvania, while Howe's army was in striking range of Philadelphia, forcing the Continental Congress to evacuate to Baltimore. With little to lose and with a few thousand extra reinforcements under General Horatio Gates, Washington planned a daring operation back across the Delaware to surprise 3 regiments of Hessian mercenaries stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. Washington planned to cross the river on the night of Christmas Day in order to surprise the enemy, whom he expected to be drunk at the time. Despite a fierce snowstorm, which meant his main column of 2,400 men only got to the other side of the river by 4 in the morning on the 26th, Washington pressed on to Trenton. Although the Hessians were sober, they failed to believe that Washington would attempt such a daring operation in such foul weather. The element of surprise and the effectiveness of Henry Knox's artillery, combined with Washington's effective use of terrain to beat back a counterattack, obliged the Hessians to surrender. The Continentals killed and wounded 100 Hessians and captured 900 more, all for the loss of fewer than 10 men. While Washington is usually considered a defensive general who avoided battle with the odds against him, he was capable of some of the most daring attacks in the history of warfare. The success at Trenton was followed up by a similarly lopsided victory at Princeton a few days later, enabling Washington's men to push forward and expel the British almost completely from New Jersey. The victories provided a boost to morale and allowed Congress to move back to Philadelphia, but with only a few thousand men, Washington was obliged to remain on the defensive, launching frequent raids into enemy territory. In March 1777, the 22-year-old artillery captain Alexander Hamilton joined Washington's staff as aide-de-camp, the talented Hamilton was able to handle much of the Commander-in-Chief's correspondence and would later become his chief aide. At the end of July, Washington welcomed to his side the Marquis de Lafayette, a 20-year-old French aristocrat who shared in the political ideals of the American Revolution and defied a royal order to travel to America and volunteer his service to the cause. With Lafayette at his side, Washington and Congress hoped that France would be persuaded to join an alliance with the nascent United States. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor CuriosityStream, the #1 brand in entertainment for people who want to know more. You could think of it as the Hulu for history buffs, or the Disney Plus for the scientist in us. CuriosityStream adds new shows every week and is one of the very best deals in streaming. We've been watching Fighting for Lincoln, The Wide Awake, telling of the supporters who helped get Lincoln elected as president to contend with the issue of slavery and more. It's definitely worth a watch if you enjoy history content that doesn't pull its punches. Another great history documentary we found was the amazing story in Impossible Escapes: Civil War, the story of escape from Libby Prison during the American Civil War, telling how more than 1,000 Union soldiers endured the notorious prison in Richmond until some could take it no more. You will also find lots of other amazing documentaries on subjects such as science, music, technology, travel, as well as nature. Available to watch on all your favorite streaming devices with new shows added every week. Go to curiositystream.com/people or scan the QR code for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And for our fans, use promo code PEOPLE and you will save 25% off. It's already one of the most affordable and best deals in streaming. So click the link below or go to curiositystream.com/people and save 25% right now. During the first half of 1777, Washington remained on the defensive and awaited Howe's movements. By the end of August, the British commander landed on the Chesapeake Bay and marched on Philadelphia. Keen not to lose the capital without a fight, Washington hurried to cut him off and deployed his army amongst the ravines of Brandywine Creek on the southwestern approaches of the city, anticipating a decisive battle. On the 11th of September, Howe launched his attack, sending 5,000 Hessians to attack Washington's main defensive position in a frontal assault, while he led a force of more than 8,000 men on a long flanking maneuver, aiming to cross the Brandywine at a couple of undefended forts. While the Continentals held firm against the frontal assault, by midday Washington wondered about the whereabouts of the main enemy force, and soon began to receive reports of an enemy flanking maneuver. The American commander realized that he had been outwitted and galloped to the sector in question to find 2 brigades of redcoats, not realizing that Howe's entire force was on its way. By 4 in the afternoon, 3 columns of British troops were thrown into the attack, routing the Continentals. At the end of the battle, the Continentals sustained more than 1,000 casualties, including 400 captured, while British casualties were half the number. The defeat at Brandywine resulted in the British occupation of Philadelphia, forcing Congress to evacuate again, this time to Trenton. Although the Continentals had fought bravely at Brandywine, once again Washington's failure to prepare adequately and his inability to respond quickly when the battle did not unfold as planned resulted in catastrophe for the American cause. The American commander was not disheartened, and on the 3rd of October, less than a month after Brandywine, Washington planned a daring night attack on Howe's camp at Germantown, hoping to repeat his heroics at Trenton the previous winter. However, this time round, Washington's plans unraveled in the middle of the night, and he was forced to abandon the attack after sustaining twice as many casualties as the British once again. He tried his best to make light of the defeat in reports to Congress, and his audacious attack demonstrated to the British that there was still a lot of fight left in the battered and bruised Continental Army. While Washington's main army had suffered a series of setbacks against General Howe on the 17th of October, General Horatio Gates had defeated and captured a British army of 5,000 men under General John Burgoyne at Saratoga in New York, which had been attempting to march south to join Howe. While Washington welcomed the news of Gates' stunning victory, he felt threatened by a subordinate who had previously been a critic and whom he believed was seeking the supreme command for himself. These fears were confirmed when Gates was named as the president of the Congressional Board of War, giving him supervisory powers over Washington and his army. The Board of War also appointed General Thomas Conway as Inspector General, with extensive powers over training and discipline, which bypassed Washington, promoting him to Major General in the process. When Conway arrived at Washington's camp at Valley Forge to announce his appointment, the commander was incensed and informed Conway that his generals would not recognize his authority, obliging Congress to send Conway elsewhere. Washington had stood firm, retained his command, and increased his authority. Washington's quarters for the winter of 1777–78 at Valley Forge, 20 miles to the northwest of Philadelphia, has entered into American legend. For yet another winter, the Continental Army was in a desperate state and risked falling apart, with thousands of men sick, hungry, cold, and demoralized. Washington's efforts to beg Congress for supplies came to nothing, and he came to realize that the existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, which left most political power with individual states, gave Congress little power and undermined his efforts to create a national army. Yet Washington's presence at the camp helped to keep his men together in these trying times when other armies may have melted away, while Martha Washington's care and attention for the men won her respect and affection throughout the ranks. Washington was also helped by the arrival of Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer who had served in Frederick the Great's armies during the 7 Years' War. The Prussian army was considered the best in Europe, famous for its discipline and order, attributes which the Continentals sorely lacked. Within a matter of weeks, Steuben drilled the army in line and column formations and associated maneuvers, and also began working on a drill manual, which would remain in use by the United States Army for almost a century. By the beginning of March, Washington had 12,000 men at his disposal, ready for action. A far more significant boost to the American war effort came in the form of an alliance with France, signed in Paris on the 6th of February 1778. The alliance changed the strategic picture of the war, forcing the British troops under their new commander Sir Henry Clinton to withdraw from Philadelphia to New York and attach 8,000 men to defend the West Indies from the French. While Clinton's men were on the retreat, Washington ordered General Charles Lee, recently released in a prisoner exchange, to take up his previous role as second-in-command, to lead a vanguard of 5,000 men against the British at Monmouth Court House. Lee, who had advised against the operation, launched a half-hearted attack that was easily repulsed by the British, sending the Continentals reeling and inviting a counterattack. A furious Washington rallied his reserve of 6,000 men and managed to turn the tide of the battle during 2 hours of fierce fighting. Washington decided against sending his exhausted army to pursue the British, who managed to slip away to safety in the middle of the night. In the weeks following the battle, General Lee was court-martialed and found guilty, and Washington was happy to see the back of him. For the next 3 years, the British forces turned their attention to the south. During this period, Washington would not fight a major battle, though he was by no means inactive. In the summer of 1778, the French Navy sailed up the Chesapeake to join Washington, though the cooperation between the subjects of an absolute monarchy and the citizens of a revolutionary republic was far from seamless, as the Americans realized that the French were motivated foremost by animosity against the British rather than support for the American cause. And once again, Washington found himself interacting with European military officers who looked down on Americans and rarely kept him updated on their whereabouts. The following summer, Washington managed to stop Clinton from controlling the Hudson River and cutting off New England from the rest of the United States, but this period otherwise proved uneventful. By 1780, Washington's army was low on money and supplies, and military success seemed impossible without the assistance of the French. Lafayette had been in France since the beginning of 1779 and lobbied for greater French assistance to the American cause. King Louis XVI answered the call by sending an expeditionary force of 6,000 men to America under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau, in conjunction with the fleet commanded by the Chevalier de Ternay, who landed in Newport, Rhode Island on the 10th of July 1780. Meanwhile, the Continentals had suffered a series of setbacks in the South, beginning with the loss of the port of Charleston in South Carolina in May, and followed by Horatio Gates' defeat to General Charles Cornwallis at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina on the 16th of August, whose dismissal by Congress in the aftermath of the debacle removed the final challenger to Washington's authority in the Continental Army. Worse was to follow in late September, when Washington belatedly recognized the treachery of Benedict Arnold, the courageous Continental Army officer who had fought with distinction at Saratoga, but had been nursing a wounded ego after being overlooked for promotion. In August, Arnold had been appointed commandant of the vital strategic fort of West Point, but rather than strengthen his defenses, he plotted to surrender it to the British, managing to escape just in time when the plot was discovered. By 1781, British successes in the South and Arnold's defection threatened Washington's home state of Virginia. Governor Thomas Jefferson, whose own home at Monticello had been occupied by Arnold's men, urged Washington to lead his men south to defend his home state. Though the American commander was anxious about the fate of his beloved Mount Vernon and had sent a division under Lafayette to confront Arnold in Virginia, Washington preferred to keep his men in New York and believed the decisive blow against the British would fall there, though his French allies planned an operation in the south instead. By mid-August, Washington abandoned his designs on New York when he received news that a French fleet of 29 ships under the command of Admiral de Grasse had set sail from the West Indies and intended to land a force of 3,500 men on the Chesapeake in early September. Washington had also received news from Lafayette that Cornwallis had retreated to Yorktown, located on the eastern tip of the Virginia Peninsula and surrounded by water on three sides. Washington and Rochambeau hurried south in an effort to trap Cornwallis and force him to surrender. By the beginning of September, de Grasse's fleet had arrived on the Chesapeake as planned, overcoming limited British resistance, leaving Cornwallis trapped between the French ships at sea and Lafayette's small force on land. By the 18th of September, Washington and Rochambeau met with the admiral to discuss plans for the siege. De Grasse was adamant that he would have to return to the West Indies no later than the 1st of November, allowing little more than a month for the operation. When Washington and Rochambeau began to lay siege to Yorktown on the 28th of September, the American commander deferred to his French counterpart, who was more experienced in siege tactics. Cornwallis's army of 9,000 men was significantly outnumbered by the 19,000 French and Americans besieging Yorktown, and the British general desperately pleaded for additional reinforcements from General Clinton. After the French engineers built 2 lines of trenches, allowing Allied artillery to rain down cannonballs into Yorktown on the 14th, the Allies successfully captured 2 British redoubts in front of the town, and by the 16th they were so close to the British lines that Cornwallis attempted a last-ditch evacuation across the York River, which was scuppered by poor weather. On the morning of the 17th of October 1783, Cornwallis sent Washington a message to discuss the terms of surrender, which was signed on the 19th. Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown did not end the war, but it persuaded the authorities in London that it was no longer worth sustaining the costly effort to retain the American colonies. Upon hearing of the news of Yorktown, Lord North is said to have exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." and his government duly collapsed in early 1782. Henry Clinton was replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Sir Guy Carleton, whose role was largely reduced to organizing the evacuation of British assets from their former colonies. Washington regarded Carleton's peace offers with suspicion and still anticipated continued hostilities. However, aside from a handful of skirmishes in the south over the course of 1782, the war was over, and preliminary peace terms were signed in Paris on the 30th of November, 1782, an extraordinarily generous settlement recognizing the independence of the United States of America, with borders stretching north to the Great Lakes and west to the Mississippi, setting the stage for a final peace ratified in September 1783. Although he had been the most powerful individual in the United States with an army at his disposal, Washington chose to return to life as a private citizen at Mount Vernon and relinquished his commission on the 23rd of December 1783, following the example of Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, the 5th century BC Roman general, famed for relinquishing his powers as dictator after being summoned to defeat Rome's enemies. Upon returning to Mount Vernon, Washington set out to give his estate a new lease of life after the neglect it had suffered during the war. During this period, Washington was courted by anti-slavery campaigners including Lafayette, who proposed an experiment to educate and free slaves who would become tenant farmers. Washington had always believed slavery was an economically inefficient institution, and after the war he became morally opposed to slavery, but he could not bear overhauling the entire economic system on which his livelihood as a planter depended. Like many of his fellow planters, Washington naively believed that the institution of slavery would die out naturally in the future. Despite his desire to leave public life, Washington's reputation meant that he could not remain in obscurity for long. Throughout the war, he had longed for a stronger central government that could compel the states to supply his army, and he had not departed from this belief. Washington therefore welcomed an initiative to revise the Articles of Confederation led by his former aide Alexander Hamilton and the Virginian politician James Madison, and was invited by the latter to head a delegation from Virginia to a constitutional convention in Philadelphia, scheduled for May 1787. After months of hesitation, Washington answered the call of duty and was duly elected President of the Constitutional Convention on the 25th of May. The role was a perfect fit for the non-partisan Washington, who intervened occasionally to broker agreement between different points of view. The convention was dominated by two major questions, both relating to representation. The more populous states, such as Virginia, wanted an assembly with seats allocated according to population, while smaller states desired equal representation. In mid-July, a compromise was reached whereby all states would be represented equally with 2 members in the Senate, while the seats of the House of Representatives would be based on population. The second compromise was over slavery. While slaves would not have any political rights, slave-holding states could count 3/5 of the slave population in determining their representation in Congress. The convention also created an independent executive branch from Congress, and it was widely assumed that Washington would become the first president. The proceedings in Philadelphia were concluded on the 17th of September 1787, but it was not until July 1788 when the Constitution was ratified, with Washington's native Virginia being one of the last to do so. Washington hesitated to declare his candidacy for the presidency, responding to fears that he might have royal ambitions, though his reputation as the American Cincinnatus and his childless status helped to calm fears of a hereditary monarchy and led admirers to call him Father of the Country. Thus, when the presidential election was held in early 1789, Washington was unanimously elected president, while John Adams of Massachusetts was elected vice president. After the election was certified on the 6th of April, Washington traveled to New York, the temporary home of the federal government, and was inaugurated as president on the 30th of April 1789. When Washington took office as president, the institutions of the federal government were still being set up. The Constitution had left the duties of the president deliberately vague, and it was up to Congress and Washington to delineate their respective powers. Washington's four-man cabinet was assembled by the spring of 1790, including his former subordinates in the Army and his fellow Virginians. Alexander Hamilton was appointed Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox, Secretary of War, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, and Jefferson's cousin, Edmund Randolph, as Attorney General. The Constitution did not provide for a cabinet in the British sense, and Washington typically worked directly with his cabinet secretaries. In the early stages of his presidency, Washington also relied heavily on the advice of James Madison, the father of the Constitution, who served as a congressman representing Virginia in the House of Representatives. Washington's vice president, John Adams, played a minor role in his administration and took his duties as president of the Senate more seriously. Among Washington's cabinet secretaries, the most brilliant was Alexander Hamilton, who labored hard to strengthen the power of the federal government, carrying out his duties as tirelessly as he had done as Washington's chief aide during the Revolutionary War. Unlike the president, Hamilton had a grand vision for the architecture of the federal government, and had also developed an expertise in financial matters that Washington could not match, effectively making him into an unofficial prime minister. Despite being an admirer of Washington, Jefferson viewed Hamilton's designs with suspicion, believing that they would lead to a despotic presidency, and criticized the president privately for going along with such ideas. The Hamilton and Jefferson rivalry reflected the intellectual and ideological debate over the future direction of the American government, and while Washington allowed free debate among his cabinet members, he was no impartial observer and played an active role in decision-making, controlling the agenda and requesting papers from his cabinet secretaries for his personal approval each day. Washington's leadership style was slow and deliberative, and he consulted widely before making decisions, a privilege that he did not have while a general in the heat of battle. The debate over Hamilton's economic agenda dominated Washington's presidency. In January 1790, Hamilton delivered his Report on the Public Credit, which proposed the creation of a national debt to be paid over time and financed by new taxes. Additionally, Hamilton proposed that the federal government should assume state debts, in effect transferring the loyalty of debt holders from the states to the national government. Washington shared Hamilton's belief in a powerful national government which could raise funds to meet its financial obligations, and was happy to let his Treasury Secretary work out the details. Any talk of taxation brought up memories of British colonial rule, prompting Madison to come out in opposition and break his alliance with Hamilton and Washington, withholding congressional support for the proposals. The president was disappointed by the loss of a close ally, as well as the beginnings of the split between the northern and southern states, which would continue to define American politics until the present day. Washington would also prove a supporter of Hamilton's proposals for a national bank, despite the arguments from Jefferson and his fellow Virginians that such a move would be unconstitutional. The debate over the public debt coincided with disagreements about the location of the permanent capital of the United States. Many Southerners hoped to bring the capital further to the south, and Madison favored a location in Virginia along the banks of the Potomac, where both he and Washington had property. Naturally, the president welcomed this prospect, but Congress was now deadlocked on both issues. A crucial meeting between Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison in June 1790 saw the three men broker a deal whereby the Virginians agreed to drop opposition to Hamilton's economic program in return for Hamilton supporting the proposal to move to Philadelphia as a temporary capital for 10 years while a permanent one was being built on the Potomac. Washington was given power to choose the site and duly picked a location not far from Mount Vernon, and the commissioners he had chosen to oversee the project later decided to name the city Washington in the District of Columbia. The two debates which had threatened to dissolve the Union were therefore both resolved in Washington's favor. The debate over the future of the Union and the powers of the federal government easily spilled over into foreign affairs. Although he had fought against the British, Washington and Hamilton realized that the prosperity of the United States remained dependent on trade and commerce with the former imperial master, which recovered rapidly after the end of the war. Jefferson, Washington's Secretary of State and chief foreign policy advisor, remained attached to France, especially after Louis XVI's absolute monarchy was overthrown by the Revolution of 1789, which Jefferson witnessed firsthand as ambassador to France shortly before his return to the United States. Lafayette had emerged as one of the leaders of the revolutionary government, inspired by the ideas of liberty which he had fought for in America. Washington feared that the French Revolution may descend into mob violence, a fear that proved prophetic in the subsequent years when the radical Jacobin faction took over in September 1792 and executed King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette the following year, while Lafayette was forced into exile. Despairing in Hamilton and Jefferson's rivalry, whose supporters had coalesced into two parties, the Federalists and Republicans respectively, Washington sought to bring the two men together. Despite his skill in finding common ground across political divides at the Continental Congress and in the Constitutional Convention, the president struggled to do so in the face of these two towering personalities who had taken to attacking each other by writing anonymous letters in the press. Washington intended to step down from the presidency after one term, but was persuaded by both men to stay on, believing that he was the only man who could keep the country together. During the winter of 1792, he was re-elected to a second term, while Adams remained in post as vice president, seeing off a challenge from Jefferson. However, the Jeffersonian Republicans had won a clear majority in the House of Representatives, setting the stage for strong congressional opposition to Washington's administration during his second term. Washington's second term was dominated by foreign policy issues arising from the war which had broken out between Britain and France in 1792. While Jefferson argued that the United States and France were still allies from the war, Hamilton and Knox believed that the alliance was null and void now that Louis XVI had been overthrown and executed. Washington hoped to remain neutral between the two warring nations, knowing that the United States was too weak to exert much diplomatic or military pressure. Following Washington's proclamation of American neutrality on the 22nd of April 1793, the French envoy Edmond Charles Genet went to Philadelphia in an effort to persuade the United States to go to war against Britain. While the Frenchman proved popular among the American public, Washington received him coldly as someone seeking to interfere in American politics. Genet made matters worse by encouraging French privateers attacking British shipping to sail into American ports and threatened to go over Washington's head and appeal to the American people. These insults damaged the pro-French cause and prompted the American cabinet to ask for Genet's recall. But upon learning that the Jacobins were recalling their envoy and planned to put him on trial, Washington granted him asylum in the United States. The conduct of the British during this period also increased tensions with the United States. In the summer of 1793, the British began to intercept neutral ships bound for French ports, thereby confiscating the cargo of American ships. The British Navy's practice of impressment, rounding up British deserters aboard American ships to serve in the Navy, frequently caught innocent Americans in the net. Responding to Federalist calls for a special envoy to be sent to Britain to negotiate a treaty of commerce and defuse the threat of war, Washington dispatched John Jay, an experienced diplomat who was serving as Chief Justice, a choice which raised questions about the separation of powers between the judicial and executive branches of government. The treaty negotiated by Jay in February 1795 did not address all of the American grievances and tilted the economic relationship in favor of Britain, but stopped the drift towards war. Washington was prepared to sign this imperfect document, but its publication in the press provoked outrage among the Republicans. Jefferson had left his post of Secretary of State in 1793 and attempted to rally House Republicans to withhold funding to implement the treaty. The attempt failed narrowly, but promoted Washington to break his ties with his erstwhile friend and advisor. Washington's support for the Jay Treaty provoked a tide of Republican criticism, and the luster of his exploits during the Revolutionary War was no longer sufficient to shore up his reputation in Jeffersonian circles. Exhausted by the burdens of office and having suffered from a series of illnesses during his presidency, the 64-year-old Washington announced his desire to retire from public life after serving out his second term. By doing so, he created a powerful precedent of a two-term limit that would only be broken once. In his farewell address, drafted by Hamilton and published in September 1796, the departing president pleaded for national unity in the face of domestic and international challenges. Washington was succeeded by John Adams on the 4th of March 1797, but his calls for unity went unheeded, and the factionalism between the Federalists and Republicans would only become more intense. Washington's retirement would prove to be short, and when war with France appeared imminent in 1798, Washington was named as the head of the army, but his efforts to have Alexander Hamilton as his second-in-command in the stead of more senior officers such as Henry Knox was vigorously opposed by President Adams, poisoning Washington's relations with both Adams and Knox. Diplomatic overtures to France managed to avert the tide of war, and Washington returned to Mount Vernon. He retained an active interest in farming matters despite his advanced age, and on the 12th of December 1799, he spent 5 hours riding around his estate, encountering an unexpected snowstorm. The exposure to the elements made him ill, and he died on the 14th of December 1799. A few months before his death, Washington wrote a new will which stipulated that his property would pass on to Martha, but upon her death, the 120 slaves he left her would be freed. Martha had not been consulted on the will and was afraid that the slaves might be motivated to kill her, and decided to free her late husband's slaves on the 1st of January 1801, a little more than a year before her own death in May 1802. Washington's death was met with widespread mourning across the United States, and he continues to be admired as one of America's greatest generals and presidents. Over the course of his 67 years, he had been a key participant in some of the most important events in world history. Born into a colonial family of modest means, Washington began his military career as a headstrong officer in the British colonial army, resentful of his treatment by London. He would end it as the man who defeated one of the most formidable European armies in war, securing independence for a country founded on the principles of liberty and equality. He would then play a key role in the establishment and consolidation of the American political system by presiding over the Constitutional Convention and serving as the first President of the United States. Washington's belief in a strong federal government to ensure the security and prosperity of the new nation made him an opponent of his fellow Virginian planters, but helped to pave the way for the United States to become the global hegemon of the 21st century. The universal admiration for Washington may overlook some of his deficiencies as a soldier and politician. Over the course of his military career, Washington lost more battles than he won, and his mistakes at New York and Brandywine were responsible for devastating defeats. While Washington managed to keep his army alive, he could not have dealt the victorious blow at Yorktown without the assistance of the French army and navy. As a politician, Washington lacked the intellectual vision of the likes of Hamilton and Jefferson, and was naive to believe that it was possible to avoid the partisan divides that have defined American politics ever since. On the issue of slavery, while Washington's attitude later in life was far more progressive than most of his peers, he was unwilling to challenge the Southern planters on the future of the institution. even after breaking with them on Hamilton's economic program. Instead, he would defer the issue to future generations of political leaders. What do you think of George Washington? Was he a great military figure whose inspirational leadership enabled a ragtag army to defeat the might of the British Empire, and a skillful politician whose pragmatism held the Union together while the Constitution laid down its roots? Or was he a mediocre general and a politician who was given the credit rightfully belonging to his subordinates and allies, both in war and politics? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.